My sister Sarah stood in front of 50 Navy officers and called me a washed-up has-been living off disability, laughing as she told them I was too broken to serve my country anymore, that I should stop pretending I was still relevant to the military. Until Commander Patricia Wells walked through those doors, looked directly at me and said the words that shattered Sarah's world. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Kane, on behalf of the United States Navy, I salute you for Operation Silent Shield. My sister Sarah stood in front of 50 Navy officers and called me a washed-up has-been living off disability. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Laughing as she told them I was too broken to serve my country anymore, that I should stop pretending I was still relevant to the military. Until Commander Patricia Wells walked through those doors, looked directly at me, and said the words that shattered Sarah's world. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Kane, on behalf of the United States Navy, I salute you for Operation Silent Shield. I hadn't set foot on a military base in almost 3 years, not since my medical discharge from the Navy SEALs, not since they discovered the extent of my injuries from the IED blast in Syria, not since my family turned my early retirement into a source of shame. The invitation came on official Navy letterhead, Sarah's promotion ceremony to Lieutenant Commander. Her handwritten note at the bottom, time to see what real naval officers look like. The silence had been my protection for 3 years. Every VA appointment, every disability evaluation, every sleepless night wondering if maybe they were right about my being damaged goods. I'd learned to keep quiet about my service record, my classified missions, my contributions to naval intelligence operations, that I couldn't discuss with anyone who lacked the proper clearance. Sarah had made it clear what she thought of my situation during our last conversation. You got yourself blown up and now you expect everyone to treat you like a hero, she'd said outside the VA hospital after my final physical therapy session. Real naval officers adapt and overcome. You just adapted to a disability check. Even our parents had stopped defending me after the third family dinner, where I'd excused myself early due to chronic pain. Maybe Sarah has a point, our mother had whispered when she thought I couldn't hear. Maybe it's time you found a new identity beyond being a wounded veteran. The small apartment I'd rented near the coast had become my world. 2 rooms, a view of the ocean that reminded me of better days, and the constant sound of waves that sometimes helped drown out the ringing in my ears from the blast. I spent my days doing physical therapy, attending counseling sessions, and trying to rebuild a sense of purpose that didn't revolve around classified operations I couldn't talk about. But what my family didn't know was that I hadn't completely severed ties with the Navy. 3 months after my discharge, I'd been quietly recruited for a different kind of service, consulting work for naval intelligence on counterterrorism operations. The work was sporadic, highly classified, and conducted entirely through encrypted communications from my apartment. My official status was medically retired. My unofficial status was strategic consultant with specialized knowledge of enemy tactics. The Navy had lost a SEAL, but gained an analyst whose ground-level experience with terrorist networks was invaluable for planning future operations. The projects had been small at first, reviewing mission plans, identifying potential security risks, providing tactical advice based on my field experience. But 6 months ago, something bigger had landed on my secure server. Operation Silent Shield, a complex counterintelligence operation designed to identify and neutralize a terrorist cell planning attacks on U.S. naval installations. I'd spent 4 months working 18-hour days from my apartment, coordinating with active-duty personnel, analyzing intercepted communications, and developing the strategic framework that ultimately prevented 3 major attacks on naval bases across the Pacific Fleet. But I couldn't tell anyone, not my family, not my therapist, not even Sarah, who worked in the same naval intelligence community and thought I was just collecting disability checks while watching Netflix. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Sarah was building her career on routine intelligence reports and administrative excellence, I was quietly helping to protect the very bases where her colleagues served. While she told people I was too broken to contribute to national security, I was actively engaged in operations that safeguarded American lives. Tonight, everything would change. Call it courage, call it curiosity, but for the first time in 3 years, I decided to face the world that had written me off. I wore my dress blues, the same uniform I'd been discharged in 3 years ago, now slightly loose from weight loss, but still carrying the ribbons and decorations I'd earned in classified operations. I walked into the Naval Station Norfolk Officers Club alone, past clusters of active duty personnel in their crisp uniforms, ignoring the double takes and whispered recognition from those who remembered me from before the blast. The reception hall was elegant in that distinctly military way: polished brass fixtures, maritime paintings, and the smell of floor wax mixed with coffee from the catering station. There were designated seating areas based on rank and position within Sarah's command structure. Her fellow lieutenant commanders occupied the tables closest to the podium. Junior officers filled the middle section. Senior enlisted personnel and support staff were relegated to the back. My name wasn't on any seating chart. A nervous petty officer finally pointed me toward a single chair near the entrance, positioned where late arrivals typically stood during ceremonies. No place card, no table assignment, just a folding chair that looked borrowed from a storage closet. The message was unmistakable. I wasn't part of the active duty Navy anymore, regardless of what my uniform suggested. I sat quietly, watching Sarah work the room with practiced military bearing. She moved between groups of officers with confident efficiency, discussing deployment schedules and intelligence briefings, with the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted her place in the naval hierarchy. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture perfect, her smile the kind reserved for career advancement opportunities. But I could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Someone at the lieutenant commander table murmured just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "That's Sarah's sister. The one who got blown up and medically discharged. Sad case." Uncomfortable nods followed. A female officer I didn't recognize leaned toward her companion and whispered, "I heard she's been struggling with PTSD. Such a waste of SEAL training." The comments hit like small caliber rounds, not immediately devastating, but accumulating damage with each impact. I trained myself not to react to these assessments of my worth, not to correct the narrative, just to endure whatever social obligation had brought me back into uniform. Sarah's commanding officer, Commander Patricia Wells, moved through the room greeting dignitaries and senior staff. She was a legend in naval intelligence. 25 years of distinguished service, multiple deployments, and a reputation for operational excellence that made junior officers nervous just being in her presence. Sarah clearly basked in the reflected glory of serving under such a respected commander. Meanwhile, I remained invisible in my corner, present but not acknowledged. Sarah's colleagues began sharing stories of recent operations, comparing assignment locations, and discussing career progression strategies. Their conversation flowed around topics I couldn't participate in: current deployments, active security clearances, ongoing missions that required operational status I no longer possessed. The contrast was deliberate and painful. Sarah's achievements were meant to shine brighter against my apparent failure. Her active duty status felt more valuable when measured against my medical retirement. I was the cautionary tale that made her choices seem more impressive, the sister who'd been broken by service while she'd been strengthened by it. As the ceremony began and Sarah prepared to receive her promotion, I realized I was more than just family obligation tonight. I was living proof that Sarah had chosen the better path, evidence that she possessed whatever resilience I'd lacked when faced with combat trauma. Sarah took the podium with the bearing of someone who'd never questioned her right to be there. Her voice carried across the reception hall with crisp military authority, honed through years of briefing senior officers and commanding respect from subordinates. "Thank you all for being here to witness this milestone in my naval career," she began, adjusting her new lieutenant commander insignia with obvious pride. She paused, scanning the room with the calculated confidence of someone who'd mastered the art of military leadership. "Today represents more than just a promotion. It's a testament to the values that define true naval service: perseverance through adversity, commitment despite challenges, and the wisdom to know when sacrifice serves a greater purpose." The room murmured approval. Commander Wells nodded approvingly from the front row. Several officers shifted forward in their seats, recognizing the tone of a speech that would reinforce their own career choices and dedication to active service. "The Navy taught me that true strength isn't about avoiding difficult situations," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the inspirational cadence she'd perfected in leadership training. It's about facing them head-on and emerging stronger. Some people fold under pressure. Others use that pressure to forge themselves into better leaders. I felt every eye in the room flick toward my corner, though Sarah hadn't looked at me directly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She didn't need to. The implication was crystal clear to everyone wearing a uniform in that room. I've learned that the greatest honor we can give our fellow service members is honest recognition of what separates those who endure from those who retire early. The pause was deliberate, calculated for maximum impact. Real naval officers don't just survive their challenges. They transform those challenges into stronger service to their country. Several officers nodded knowingly. A lieutenant at table 3 raised his coffee cup in silent agreement. The room was beginning to understand exactly what kind of speech this was becoming. Sarah's voice rose with practiced emotion. Tonight I stand before you not just as your newly promoted lieutenant commander, but as someone who chose to stay the course when others might have chosen easier paths. I chose active duty over disability retirement. I chose continued service over comfortable retreat. The applause started slowly, then built as officers throughout the room recognized the implicit comparison being drawn. Someone near the back called out, "Hoo-yah!" in support of Sarah's dedication. More hands clapped in celebration of her commitment to naval values. I want to thank everyone who taught me that honor comes not from what happens to you, but from what you choose to do next, Sarah declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to stop enabling their excuses and start expecting excellence instead. The crowd erupted in sustained applause. Officers throughout the room stood, recognizing Sarah's words as a call to higher standards and personal accountability. Commander Wells herself rose to her feet, clapping with obvious approval for Sarah's leadership philosophy. "Chillin'. I didn't stand. I didn't clap. I didn't leave like they probably expected me to. I just sat in my borrowed chair, watching 50 naval officers celebrate my sister's implicit declaration that I was exactly the kind of person real sailors refuse to become." The message was unmistakable. Sarah had faced the same military challenges I had, but she'd chosen strength while I'd chosen surrender. Her promotion wasn't just recognition of her achievements, it was vindication of her superior character. Every officer in that room was applauding not just Sarah's success, but their collective agreement that she represented everything I'd failed to be. Then the reception hall doors opened with the kind of authority that cuts through celebration, like a blade through silk. Commander Patricia Wells stepped forward, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked 2 figures in dress uniforms whose presence immediately shifted the room's entire atmosphere. Admiral Rebecca Morrison, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Captain Daniel Torres from Naval Special Warfare Command. The casual chatter died instantly, as every officer in the room snapped to attention, recognizing the kind of senior leadership that doesn't appear at routine promotion ceremonies. Even Sarah's voice faltered mid-sentence, her microphone crackling as her grip tightened around it. The confident smile that had carried her through 20 minutes of subtle character assassination froze on her face, as she watched 3 of the Navy's most senior officers move through the room with unmistakable purpose. But they weren't walking toward the podium where Sarah stood. They weren't approaching the head table where her fellow lieutenant commanders sat in stunned silence. Admiral Morrison's polished shoes clicked against the polished floor with military precision as she made her way directly toward my corner chair. The entire room held its breath, as 50 naval officers watched the Pacific Fleet commander stop in front of the washed-up has-been they'd just been celebrating their superiority over. Admiral Morrison's presence commanded the kind of respect that made lieutenant commanders feel like midshipmen again. "Lieutenant Commander Jessica Kane," Admiral Morrison said, her voice carrying across the silent room with crystalline clarity. "Would you please stand?" I rose slowly from my folding chair, my back straightening into the military, bearing that 3 years of civilian life hadn't completely erased. The room watched in absolute silence as I came to attention before the most senior naval officer many of them had ever seen in person. Admiral Morrison's expression was unreadable as she studied my face, then glanced at the ribbons and decorations on my uniform, ribbons whose significance most of the room couldn't fully comprehend due to their classified nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Morrison announced, turning to address the room while keeping her attention focused on me. "I'd like you to meet the architect of Operation Silent Shield, the counter-terrorism operation that prevented coordinated attacks on 3 Pacific Fleet installations over the past 6 months." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was seismic. I heard someone's coffee cup hit the floor with a ceramic crash. Sarah's microphone slipped from her trembling fingers, creating a sharp feedback screech that made several officers wince. Captain Torres stepped forward, his voice adding weight to Admiral Morrison's words. "Lieutenant Commander Kane's intelligence analysis and strategic planning prevented what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack on U.S. naval facilities since the USS Cole bombing." Admiral Morrison's expression shifted to something approaching pride. Working from her civilian residence, with limited resources and no operational support, Lieutenant Commander Kane identified terrorist communications, predicted attack vectors, and developed the countermeasures that saved the lives of over 2,000 naval personnel. She turned back to me, her voice carrying the kind of respect reserved for extraordinary service. "Lieutenant Commander Kane, on behalf of the United States Navy and the families of every sailor you protected, I salute you." Admiral Morrison raised her hand in a crisp military salute, followed immediately by Captain Torres and Commander Wells. The gesture rippled through the room as 50 naval officers rose to their feet and saluted the broken veteran they'd been celebrating their superiority over just moments before. I returned the salute with whatever composure I could summon, my muscle memory overriding the shock coursing through my system. "Thank you, Admiral Morrison. It was an honor to serve." As the room slowly lowered their salutes, Admiral Morrison continued speaking, but her words were directed toward the officers who had just witnessed their understanding of naval service completely upended. "Lieutenant Commander Kane's work exemplifies the highest traditions of naval intelligence. Her analysis of intercepted communications led to the identification of a sophisticated terrorist network that had been planning simultaneous attacks for over 18 months. She gestured toward Captain Torres, who stepped forward with the bearing of someone about to deliver classified information to a roomful of people who suddenly realized they weren't as informed as they'd thought. The operation required someone with both extensive field experience and advanced analytical capabilities, Captain Torres said, his voice carrying the authority of Naval Special Warfare Command. "We needed someone who understood terrorist tactics from ground-level experience, but who could also synthesize complex intelligence patterns from a strategic perspective." Admiral Morrison nodded, then looked directly at Sarah, who remained frozen at the podium like a statue carved from pure humiliation. "We're particularly grateful to whoever recommended Lieutenant Commander Kane for this assignment. It's unusual for family members to have such detailed knowledge of classified capabilities and security clearances." That's when I caught it, the flicker of recognition that crossed Sarah's face. Not confusion, not surprise, but something much more dangerous. Guilt mixed with panic. The expression of someone who'd just realized their private actions were about to become very public. Admiral Morrison continued, seemingly unaware of Sarah's reaction. "Someone from this command structure submitted a detailed assessment of Lieutenant Commander Kane's psychological fitness and operational capabilities 6 months ago. They seemed very knowledgeable about her medical status and current availability for classified work. My stomach dropped like a stone through cold water. I'd never applied for reinstatement to classified operations. I'd never submitted psychological evaluations or fitness assessments. My recruitment to Operation Silent Shield had come through back channels I'd assumed were routine naval intelligence protocols." Captain Torres pulled out a tablet, consulting what looked like official correspondence. The initial recommendation was quite specific about Lieutenant Commander Kane's expertise in Middle Eastern terrorist networks and her unique perspective on IED tactics. Very detailed intelligence about her service record and medical discharge circumstances. I felt the blood drain from my face as the pieces started connecting. My service record was classified. My medical discharge details were protected information. The only person outside of naval intelligence who had access to that level of detail about my background was someone with both family knowledge and security clearance within the same command structure. Sarah's hands were visibly shaking now as she gripped the podium for support. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the reception hall's air conditioning. She looked like someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Admiral Morrison's expression remained professional, but there was something calculating in her eyes as she continued. The recommendation emphasized that Lieutenant Commander Kane was eager to contribute despite her medical retirement status, and that she would be particularly motivated to prove her continued value to naval operations. My chest tightened. I'd never expressed eagerness for reinstatement. I'd been content with my medical retirement, focusing on healing and adjustment to civilian life. Someone had volunteered me for Operation Silent Shield, someone who knew exactly how to position my background and capabilities to make me irresistible to naval intelligence recruiters. Sarah was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Raw, desperate fear mixed with the dawning realization that her private manipulations were about to become very public knowledge. Later, in the empty parking lot outside the officers' club, Admiral Morrison waited by her staff car while Captain Torres dismissed her security detail. The celebration had resumed inside, but with a strange, subdued energy, like a funeral where everyone was pretending it was still a wedding. "Lieutenant Commander Kane," Admiral Morrison said quietly as I approached, "I didn't come here just for a promotion ceremony. There's something you need to know about how you were recruited for Operation Silent Shield." My chest tightened with the same dread I'd felt during IED sweeps in Syria. "What do you mean, Admiral?" Captain Torres pulled out his secure tablet, scrolling through what looked like official correspondence marked with classification levels I recognized from my active duty days. 6 months ago, someone within naval intelligence submitted a detailed personnel recommendation for classified operations. They provided extensive documentation about your capabilities, your psychological profile, and your availability for special assignment. The words hit like incoming artillery. I'd assumed my recruitment was routine, the Navy reaching out to qualified retirees for consulting work. I'd never questioned how they'd found me, or why they'd approached me specifically. "The concerning aspect," Admiral Morrison continued, "is that this recommendation came from someone with intimate knowledge of your medical records, your classified service history, and your current living situation. Details that should only be accessible to someone with both security clearance and personal familiarity." She handed me the tablet, showing me an email thread I'd never seen before. The sender was listed as Lieutenant Sarah Kane, Naval Intelligence Specialist, with an official Navy domain. My hands started shaking as I read Sarah's words. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Kane represents an untapped resource for counterterrorism operations. Her field experience with explosive devices and terrorist tactics, combined with her current psychological isolation, makes her ideal for deep cover analytical work. She would be highly motivated to prove her continued value to naval operations. "Sarah positioned herself as your military liaison," Captain Torres explained. "She provided detailed assessments of your mental state, your financial situation, and your desperate need for purpose following medical retirement. The recommendation painted you as someone who required rescue rather than recruitment." I stared at the screen, watching my privacy dissolve into bureaucratic betrayal. While I had been struggling with civilian adjustment and wondering about my future, Sarah had been actively managing my military career from behind a desk. "The most troubling element," Admiral Morrison said, "is that Sarah specifically requested all operational briefings and psychological evaluations be routed through her office for, quote, family coordination. She claimed you were too fragile for direct military communication and needed careful management of any classified exposure." My stomach turned as the implications became clear. What kind of evaluations? Captain Torres scrolled to another section of the correspondence. Sarah requested that any mission assignments be structured as therapeutic rehabilitation rather than operational necessity. She emphasized that you needed to feel useful without being given actual responsibility for critical outcomes. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Sarah hadn't been protecting me from military stress. She'd been sabotaging my professional credibility from the beginning. Every briefing, every assignment, every interaction with naval intelligence had been filtered through her narrative of my limitations. "We almost classified you as a limited-duty consultant," Admiral Morrison admitted. Sarah's assessment suggested someone who could provide historical perspective but lacked the stability for real-time operational decision-making. "It was only when your analysis prevented the first attack that we realized we were dealing with strategic brilliance, not therapeutic busywork." I handed the tablet back with trembling fingers. How did you figure out she wasn't representing my interests? When we tried to brief you directly last month on elevated threat levels, Sarah intercepted our communications. She claimed you were having difficult days and couldn't handle additional operational stress. That's when we decided to investigate further. Admiral Morrison's expression grew serious. Lieutenant Commander Kane, your sister has been systematically undermining your military reputation while positioning herself as your guardian and handler. The question is, what else has she been manipulating? That night, I returned to my apartment with Admiral Morrison's secure tablet and access codes to the Naval Intelligence Database. What I found in Sarah's digital footprint made my IED injuries feel like paper cuts compared to the devastation of systematic family betrayal. Sarah's workstation showed a pattern of access that painted a disturbing picture. For the past 3 years, she'd been monitoring my VA records, my medical appointments, my prescription medications, and my therapy sessions. Every piece of my recovery had been documented, analyzed, and weaponized for her professional advancement. In a classified folder labeled Special Consultant Management, I found detailed psychological profiles she'd compiled about my emotional state, my triggers, my daily routines, and my responses to military-related stress. She'd been studying me like a lab specimen, documenting every moment of vulnerability to support her narrative of my professional incompetence. The email archives revealed the full scope of her manipulation. Messages to naval intelligence superiors describing my concerning behavior patterns, reports about my increasing isolation and dependency, and detailed assessments of my diminished cognitive capacity following traumatic brain injury. But it was the folder marked Career Protection Protocols that shattered whatever remained of my trust and family loyalty. Sarah had been systematically intercepting job opportunities, consulting offers, and security clearance reinstatement requests for 3 years. Every chance I might have had to rebuild my military career had been filtered through her assessment of how it might impact her own professional trajectory. One particularly damaging document was a memo to her commanding officer requesting that any contact with me be routed through her office to prevent psychological destabilization and potential security risks. She'd convinced her superiors that direct military communication could trigger episodes that might compromise classified information. The most devastating discovery was a series of psychological evaluations she'd secretly submitted to the VA on my behalf, recommending increased medication, extended therapy, and long-term disability status. Sarah had been actively working to ensure my medical retirement became permanent, using her security clearance to access and manipulate my treatment protocols. In her personal files, I found transcribed recordings of our family conversations, detailed notes about my reactions to military topics, and comprehensive logs of my social interactions. She'd been conducting psychological surveillance on her own sister, building a clinical case file that portrayed me as increasingly unstable and unfit for any level of military responsibility. But the folder that destroyed me completely was labeled Contingency Planning. Inside were drafted recommendations for psychiatric evaluation, legal guardianship proceedings, and long-term care placement. Sarah had been preparing for the day when my deteriorating mental state would require family intervention and medical confinement. One draft memo to a military psychiatrist read, "Lieutenant Commander Kane's PTSD has progressed beyond manageable levels. Her obsession with returning to active duty represents a dangerous delusion that threatens both her recovery and operational security. Recommend immediate evaluation for residential treatment and permanent restriction from classified environments." The dates on these files revealed that Sarah had been planning my professional destruction from the moment I'd been medically discharged. Every family dinner where she'd seemed concerned about my adjustment, every conversation where she'd encouraged me to focus on healing, every suggestion that I should accept my new reality. All of it had been cover for a systematic campaign to ensure I never returned to military service. Sarah hadn't just been protecting her career from her broken sister's embarrassment. She'd been eliminating competition from someone whose classified achievements and combat experience made her own intelligence work look routine by comparison. My medical retirement had created an opportunity for Sarah to shine without the shadow of her decorated older sister overshadowing her accomplishments. I sat in my apartment at 0300, surrounded by evidence that my own sister had been treating my recovery as a threat to be managed rather than a family member to be supported. The next morning, I found Sarah at the base commissary, where she always grabbed coffee before her 0700 intelligence briefings. She was scrolling through classified emails on her secure phone, probably managing the fallout from last night's unexpected revelations. When she saw me approaching with a manila folder and Admiral Morrison's tablet, her face went pale beneath her regulation, perfect makeup. "Jess," she said, quickly closing her phone and forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd still be basking in your moment of glory from last night." I sat down across from her at the small metal table, placing the folder between us with the deliberate precision of someone arming an explosive device. The commissary buzzed around us with morning routine, sailors grabbing breakfast before duty shifts, officers reviewing daily schedules, but our corner felt isolated, like we were sitting in a classified briefing room. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the rage building behind my sternum. "Have you been accessing my medical records without authorization?" Her coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down too quickly. "That's a strange question, Jess. You know I work in intelligence, not medical administration. Why would I have access to your VA files?" I opened the folder and spread the first set of printouts across the table. Screenshots of her database queries, timestamps showing repeated access to my psychological evaluations, copies of reports she'd submitted to naval intelligence about my mental fitness. "Because someone with your security clearance has been very busy managing my recovery behind my back." Sarah's eyes darted to the papers, then to the commissary exit, calculating escape routes like we were under enemy fire. I watched her process the evidence, weigh denials, search for angles that might salvage the situation. "You went through classified databases?" she asked, her voice rising with false indignation. "That's a violation of operational security, Jessica. Just because you're having some kind of paranoid breakdown doesn't give you the right to access." "Paranoid breakdown?" I interrupted, pulling out the second stack of evidence. "Is that what you call discovering that my own sister has been sabotaging my military career for 3 years?" I slid Admiral Morrison's tablet across the table, showing her own emails describing me as psychologically unstable and quote, requiring family management to prevent security risks. Sarah's face went gray as she recognized her own words recommending that I be classified as permanently unfit for military service. "Sarah, you convinced naval intelligence that I was mentally incompetent. You intercepted job opportunities, manipulated my medical treatment, and positioned yourself as my guardian without my knowledge or consent." She leaned back in her chair, her officer training finally overriding her panic. "Jessica, you have to understand this from my perspective. You came back from Syria broken, struggling, barely functional. I was trying to protect you from taking on responsibilities you couldn't handle. By lying about my capabilities to prevent me from working, by being realistic about your limitations," her voice cracked with frustration, drawing stares from nearby tables. "You disappeared into that apartment and started living in denial about your condition. I was protecting you from another devastating failure." I pulled out the most damaging evidence: her secret recordings of family conversations, her plans for psychiatric commitment, her systematic manipulation of my VA benefits. "Were you protecting me when you planned to have me institutionalized?" Sarah stared at the papers like they contained live ordnance. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. Finally, she found her voice. "You needed professional help, Jessica. Real help. Not this fantasy that you could just return to classified operations like nothing had happened. My fantasy just saved 2,000 naval personnel from terrorist attacks." "That's impossible," she whispered. "I read your psychological evaluations. You were barely functional, struggling with basic civilian adjustment." The admission hung between us like cordite smoke. Sarah had just confessed to accessing classified medical records, while simultaneously dismissing my professional competence, based on information she'd illegally obtained and deliberately misrepresented. "You were so convinced I was broken," I said quietly, "that you never considered I might be healing." The Naval Intelligence formal review was scheduled for the following Friday at Norfolk's main administration building. I sat in that sterile conference room surrounded by senior officers, investigators, and legal personnel, while Sarah's latest desperate attempt to discredit me was being presented to the board. She'd filed a formal complaint with Naval Criminal Investigative Service, claiming I had illegally accessed classified databases and violated operational security protocols. Her written statement, read aloud by the investigating officer, painted me as a mentally unstable veteran whose delusional episodes had led to unauthorized intelligence gathering and potential security breaches. Lieutenant Commander Kane has demonstrated a pattern of erratic behavior and paranoid ideation, Sarah's statement continued. Her recent claims about Operation Silent Shield appear to be elaborate fantasies designed to justify her inappropriate access to classified materials. Any operational success should be attributed to the dedicated intelligence professionals who actually conducted the analysis. Each word felt like a court-martial proceeding where the evidence had been fabricated by someone who knew exactly how to exploit military justice protocols. The review board exchanged concerned glances, clearly struggling with the implications of psychological instability versus operational security, until Admiral Morrison entered the conference room, followed by Captain Torres and a figure that made every officer in the room snap to attention. Secretary of the Navy Patricia Dalton, whose presence at a routine personnel review meant this case had escalated far beyond family dysfunction. "If I may," Admiral Morrison said, approaching the presentation screen with a classified briefing folder that bore markings I recognized from the highest levels of national security, "I'd like to address Lieutenant Commander Kane's competency with some recently declassified operational data." The room's attention shifted from Sarah's character assassination to Admiral Morrison's presentation as she began displaying intelligence reports, terrorist communication intercepts, and timeline analyses that filled the screen with evidence of Sarah's systematic deception. Operation Silent Shield prevented coordinated attacks on Naval Station San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, Admiral Morrison announced. The intelligence analysis that identified these threats came exclusively from Lieutenant Commander Kane's work, conducted independently from any official intelligence channels. She clicked to the next slide, showing communication logs between terrorist cells that had been decoded using methodologies Sarah's department had failed to recognize. Lieutenant Commander Kane identified attack planning patterns that our active duty analysts had missed entirely. Her field experience with explosive devices allowed her to recognize tactical signatures that standard intelligence protocols couldn't detect. Secretary Dalton stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who briefed the president on national security matters. "The methodology Lieutenant Commander Kane developed for predicting terrorist attack vectors has been classified as critical to Homeland Security. We're implementing her protocols across all naval intelligence divisions." But then something completely unexpected happened. The conference room doors opened and my parents walked in, followed by two men in Navy dress uniforms I didn't immediately recognize: Commander Michael Hayes from Naval Special Warfare and Captain Jennifer Rodriguez from the Pentagon's Special Operations Command. "I'm sorry to interrupt this proceeding," my father said, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver testimony that would change everything. "But there's classified information this board needs to know about my daughter's service record." Commander Hayes stepped forward, addressing the room with the bearing of someone accustomed to briefing senior leadership on sensitive operations. Lieutenant Commander Kane's medical discharge was classified cover for her transition to deep cover intelligence work. Her apparent retirement was operational necessity, not medical limitation. Captain Rodriguez opened a classified briefing folder, revealing documents that made several board members lean forward with recognition. For the past 3 years, Lieutenant Commander Kane has been conducting classified analysis for counterterrorism operations while maintaining civilian cover. Her sister's interference nearly compromised multiple ongoing investigations. My father's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. "Sarah convinced us that Jessica was struggling with PTSD and needed family protection from military stress. We didn't know she was actively serving her country in ways we couldn't understand or discuss." Admiral Morrison smiled, the kind of expression reserved for delivering justice after years of injustice. "Lieutenant Commander Kane, the Secretary of the Navy would like to offer you reinstatement to active duty with immediate promotion to commander, effective today." Sarah was arrested that afternoon in the Naval Intelligence Building's parking lot. The charges included unauthorized access to classified medical records, obstruction of naval operations, and violation of the Espionage Act for manipulating intelligence assessments. As the Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents escorted her past the security checkpoint, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, No longer the confident intelligence officer who'd built her career on managing other people's limitations, just a woman who'd gambled everything on keeping her sister buried. The military justice proceedings moved with the efficiency of a system designed to protect national security from internal threats. Sarah's systematic sabotage of my career, her manipulation of classified psychological evaluations, and her interference with counterterrorism operations painted a picture of calculated betrayal that went far beyond sibling rivalry. Within 2 weeks, she'd been stripped of her security clearance, discharged from the Navy, and was facing federal prosecution for obstruction of national security operations. But the conversation that mattered most happened 5 days later in my parents' kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd told me I needed to accept my limitations, where family dinners had become exercises in managing expectations around my broken condition. I sat across from them at the familiar oak table, now wearing the shoulder boards of a newly promoted commander, fielding calls from Pentagon officials and counterterrorism specialists who wanted to discuss expanding the Silent Shield protocols. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. Their daughter, who'd once been written off as a disabled veteran requiring family management, now briefing senior leadership on national security matters. "We kept telling ourselves we were protecting you," my mother said, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago. "After you came back from Syria, after the medical discharge, we thought the kindest thing we could do was help you accept a quieter life. Sarah made it seem like pushing you toward military service would only cause more trauma." My father nodded, his eyes carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of misguided compassion. "She had explanations for everything. Why your projects were just therapy exercises. Why encouraging your military ambitions would worsen your PTSD. Why protecting you from disappointment was really love." "I understand why you believed her," I said, and I meant it. Sarah built a convincing case using classified medical information and professional assessments. She made my potential look like delusion backed by official documentation. "No," my father said firmly. "We believed her because it was easier than admitting we were afraid of your strength. When you came back from the war, you were different, more focused, more intense, but also more complex. We didn't know how to support someone who could develop breakthrough counterterrorism technology while struggling with chronic pain and sleep disorders." The truth of his words settled between us like a bridge finally spanning a 3-year divide. My parents hadn't just been protecting me from disappointment. They'd been protecting themselves from the complexity of loving someone whose trauma and talent were so intricately woven together. "Sarah offered us a simple story to understand," my mother continued. "Wounded veteran needs family care and realistic expectations. We knew how to be parents to that narrative. We didn't know how to be parents to someone who could save thousands of lives while having panic attacks in crowded restaurants." I reached across the table and touched their hands. "You know what the hardest part was? Not Sarah's sabotage, or the career manipulation, or even the public humiliation at her promotion ceremony. It was believing that maybe you were right. Maybe I was too damaged to contribute anything meaningful to national security. Maybe my dreams of continued service really were just trauma responses. We never want you to diminish yourself again," my mother said through tears. "Not for Sarah, not for us, not for anyone who can't see past their own limitations to recognize your extraordinary capabilities." The months that followed moved with the momentum of a life finally aligned with its intended purpose. My promotion to commander came with assignment to the Pentagon's new Predictive Counterterrorism Division, where the Silent Shield protocols were being adapted for global implementation. Defense contractors who'd never heard of Jessica Kane suddenly wanted meetings with the architect of revolutionary threat assessment methodologies. But the moment that defined everything happened 8 months later, when I stood in the Pentagon's main briefing room, addressing a joint session of military intelligence leaders from all branches of service. Through the reinforced windows, I could see the Potomac River stretching toward Arlington Cemetery, where so many service members who'd given everything for national security rested in honored peace. The briefing room held over 200 senior officers, many of whom had initially questioned whether a medically retired SEAL could develop intelligence methodology sophisticated enough for modern counterterrorism. My presentation on predictive threat analysis was being broadcast to naval installations worldwide, sharing techniques that could protect military personnel from the kind of attacks that had once seemed inevitable. After the briefing, A young Navy lieutenant approached me, maybe 26, wearing the ribbons of recent Middle Eastern deployment, with the unmistakable bearing of someone transitioning from combat operations to intelligence work. "Commander Kane," she said hesitantly, "I'm Lieutenant Maria Santos, recent transfer from explosive ordnance disposal to intelligence analysis. I wanted to ask you something personal." I gestured toward the seating area near the windows, overlooking the memorial grounds. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "My family keeps telling me that my combat experience makes me too intense for analytical work," she said. "They think my ideas about integrating field experience with intelligence methodology are unrealistic, that I should focus on adjusting to desk assignments instead of pursuing advanced counterterrorism specializations." I looked at her, seeing myself 4 years ago, carrying expertise that felt too specific for the world she'd grown up in, surrounded by people who confused protection with limitation. "Lieutenant, can I ask you about your specific ideas for integration?" Her eyes lit up as she described her concept for using bomb disposal experience to predict terrorist tactics, the technical challenges of translating field knowledge into intelligence products, the potential impact on force protection protocols. She spoke with the precision and passion of someone who'd thought through every operational detail. "That's not unrealistic," I told her. "That's exactly what national security needs. The question isn't whether your family understands your potential, it's whether you're brave enough to pursue it despite their doubts." She nodded, standing straighter with renewed confidence. "Did you ever think about accepting their limitations? When everyone was telling you to be realistic about your future?" "Every day," I admitted. "But I learned something important. The people who love us sometimes try to protect us from failure, but end up protecting us from our own extraordinary capabilities instead. The only limitations that matter are the ones you choose to accept." They used to call me a broken veteran, damaged goods, someone whose service was finished. What they never understood was that true service isn't built on avoiding challenge or accepting conventional definitions of capability. It's built on the courage to believe in something bigger than the limitations others try to impose on your potential. I didn't return to service to prove them wrong. I returned because someone's life might depend on what I was brave enough to contribute. And now I protect our nation while teaching other veterans that the only war worth fighting is the one against letting other people's fears become your own boundaries. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.